It's time for another podcast by George. Straight talk, straight from the heartland, that'll have you saying, "By George, I think he's got it." Now, here's George.
Hello, hi, how are you? Welcome back in to another podcast by George. Well, let's turn to some new topics, some new issues. You know, honest to God, even me, I'm getting a little bit sick of politics. And I thought, God, as soon as the election's over, we'll start talking about some other things that I really want to talk about. But guess what? It ain't over. But if you follow the news, Trump's still in there, and he may not be leaving anytime soon. And I'm not going to cover politics every day until then. We're going to cover some other stuff. And we're going to talk today about something that I've always had an interest in, and it's aviation. And we're going to talk aviation safety in particular. And you're going to like this because our guest today is Captain John Cox. He'll be joining us on the podcast by George live line here in just a minute. But I wanted to preface this a little bit, my own experience. How I got interested in aviation. I always wanted to be a pilot as a kid, but somebody told me one day, "George, you got to be good at math." And I said, "Oh, well, I can do math." And they said, "No, you got to be good at math." And pilot's probably not in the cards for me. I'm going to put up here a photo of me when I became a newsman. This is me getting in the plane to do an air traffic report. Now, I'm just a passenger. I'm not flying this plane. But one of the advantages that I had as a reporter at WHO was I was local, and I knew the streets like the back of my hand. And I thought, well, I'm going to be a really good air traffic reporter when I get in there for Captain Jack. He went on vacation. I did the reports for him. A lot of folks remember Captain Jack. Well, at 5,000 feet, all the streets look the same. All the landmarks from the ground that I was used to, that I knew like the back of my hand, out the window. So, I mean, I got by, but I was not as good as I thought I would be. And as we introduce Captain John Cox, I wanted to tell this story, because it's kind of my story, and a lot of people have one of these, particularly if they fly a lot. And this is what happened to me. I was getting ready to fly out of Des Moines to Dallas for a big trade show. The plane was fully loaded, one of these, commercial jetliners. And we took off, and just as we're in the steep part of the ascent during takeoff, and I'm in one of the front, maybe 2 or 3 rows, somebody in the back of the passenger compartment says, "Smoke." I said, "What?" What the hell? No, come on, this can't be happening. Smoke. Yeah, so I turn around, look down the aisle. Here comes this smoke wafting up the aisle of the passenger cabin. And, oh, this can't be good. And the stewardesses get on the phone and all that kind of stuff. And it's up there where I'm at. And, being an old farm boy, I know that this isn't like, paper burning. And it's not like fuel. It smells like hot antifreeze to me. And of course, it was wintertime, and we'd been de-iced a couple of times trying to take off. And I thought, what the hell what is this? I know that antifreeze is in the de-icing or whatever, but the pilot breaks off the ascent, and we're told that they're going to turn around and go back to the airport. And this was back in the day when they had one of those phones where you could call with your credit card. So I pick up that phone, and I go, who am I going to call? Being an old newsman, maybe I ought to call a television station or something. Nah, I'm not going to do that. I call my wife. My wife says, I get her on the phone. I said, they're going to make an emergency landing. They're smoking the cabin. I don't know what's going on, but I thought I'd give you a call, tell you that I love you and all that kind of stuff. And she says, well, I want to say a prayer. Well, okay, that sounds like a good idea. So she starts to say this prayer, and then the steward comes up the aisle and says, hey, you got to put down that phone. And I'm like, what the hell? If we're going to crash, what difference does it make if I'm on the phone or not? But I'm not going to argue with him because I want things to go well. So I hang up the phone, and then we turn and come back in for the landing. And I look behind me because I'm in the front, and everybody's stony-faced, and the passenger compartment is silent. So we come in for our landing. We fly over the emergency vehicles on the runway. Now, that's an experience when you look down and see those guys, because you know what that's all about. And we landed, and it was fine. And I get off the plane, and all the news media is there to interview us when we step off the plane, because it went over the broadcast, over the radio, the police monitors, and that kind of stuff. And I'll never forget this one thing. I was watching some passengers being interviewed, and they said, I wasn't afraid. I wasn't worried about it. Matter of fact, some of us were laughing. Well, okay, remember, I was in the front row, or in the front couple of rows anyway. I saw the whole passengers compartment. There wasn't anybody laughing, and they were all real serious. I think a lot of people I think a lot of them were saying prayers like I was. But anyway, that's my story. And this guy's heard a ton of those. I'm a big fan of Captain John Cox, and I want to give this little brief bio. He's the Chief Executive Officer of Safety Operating Systems. He's a 49-year aviation veteran with experience as a corporate pilot, airline pilot, instructor, test pilot, and a safety professional. Now, in 2005, he retired from U.S. Airways. Remember that? He had a 25-year career, 14,000 hours flying, and founded Safety Operating Systems with clients worldwide, including airlines, business flight operations, legal firms, manufacturers, and government regulators. And okay, so here's how he comes to be on the show. I've been watching him for years. I'm a big fan of these documentaries on plane accidents and that type of stuff. I hate to say it makes me sound like a ghoul, but they're really interesting because they're real life. And a lot of times they have real life audio from the cockpits and stuff like that. My God, they're better than any movie, I think, because, you got to suspend your imagination a little bit for a movie. This stuff is real. So for the past 10 years, he's been the aviation analyst for NBC, MSNBC, CNBC, the Weather Channel. He regularly appears on the media everywhere, and anytime something goes wrong, and I, again, hate to say that, this is the guy you can know and trust. I mean, I look for Captain John Cox. John, welcome to a podcast by George.
Well, thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Long-winded intro there, but one thing talking about my experience in that time they had to break off the takeoff, and watching you and watching the shows that you're on, I didn't realize at the time, but just simply turning the plane fully loaded with passengers and fuel in landing can be a problem, right?
It can be a challenge. It can get pretty busy, but it's something that we train for, and it does happen sometimes when you have events like a de-icing thing that you had. But getting the airplane turned around, once you say we want to come back, and if you declare an emergency, they move all the traffic away from you. So a lot of that, and the air traffic folks are really helpful in that. So they try to simplify things, but it's just getting the airplane set up to land at an airport that what the computers weren't originally set up for. So there's a lot of typing and briefing to make sure that everything goes as it should.
Now, I've watched you, and I've watched these documentaries, and one thing they emphasize is the planes aren't intended to land fully loaded with fuel. That's a lot of extra weight. It can cause a structural issue for the plane. I mean, things can go. Sometimes they dump fuel, right?
Some of the airplanes can dump fuel, typically the larger ones, but the smaller airplanes, such as 737s or A320s, they don't have the means to dump fuel. So you have two choices. You can either land overweight, which is fine. You just want to be pretty gentle with the airplane, and there has to be an inspection performed by the maintenance staff after an overweight landing. Or you can fly around for a while and burn the fuel down till you reach your maximum landing weight. So it depends on the circumstance.
I kind of scared myself even with this introduction. And we always, talk about these scary circumstances. But I would imagine, again, with your life being in aviation safety, that people need to understand that it's still a very safe endeavor by and large. I mean, we see all the wrecks, and I watch all the TV shows and stuff, but flying has always been a pretty safe thing. And is it getting safer all the time? Am I correct in that?
It is. It's the safest form of transportation ever designed by mankind. Now, I was corrected on that by one point. Apparently, escalators have slightly fewer fatalities, but be that as it may, as far as going somewhere, the safest way to travel is by air, and it's by a lot. You're more likely to be struck by lightning. You're more likely to die in bed. You're more likely to drown in your bathtub. There's a whole lot of these comparisons. But from the time that I learned to fly, which was in 1970, to now, it has gotten unbelievably safer. It's actually surprised the industry how much better we've gotten. So yeah, it's safe, very safe.
I know a lot of folks, I want to mention this also, they can follow Captain Cox every weekday or whenever his column appears anyway in the USA Today, and he takes questions from readers. And I know a lot of people now are concerned about a new safety issue, which is this COVID thing. What's the status of safety flying commercially in COVID?
The way the airflow works in the airplane is it flushes through about every 3 minutes. So you're getting brand new clean air into the airplane, and about 25% of it goes through HEPA filtration. So the air in the airplane is actually cleaner than an air in a typical building. So and I'm flying for business out. I'm not flying nearly as much as I usually do, but the areas that I have more concern about is not the airplane itself, but the airports, and just trying to stay socially distanced when you're at the airports. I saw some research within the last month that they have looked at the particulates and how they actually move in the airplanes, and all of the doctors and things came back and said being in the airplane, even with reduced social distance, because of the way the airflow works, is safe, and they're flying. So when the doctors are flying and they've done the research, I'm pretty comfortable with it.
What about precautions for pilots? This sounds crazy, but I mean, some of these flights take several hours. Could these guys be stricken with COVID? Could they get sick while they're flying? What happens? Do they wear masks, as an example?
Yeah. The crews are wearing masks now. They initially were not, but as an effort to try to reduce the spread, and the pilots, all the crew members are being checked very frequently. So if anybody has symptoms or is exposed to someone that might be a potential COVID victim, they're pulled from flight schedule. So the idea is the airlines are taking a real systemic approach to minimize the threat to the passengers.
Well, Captain Cox, that circumstance that I mentioned off the top, I think is one of the more common causes of crashes and icing on planes, or not?
It depends. In the past, it has been, but the modern jets, they've got the capability of making a lot of hot air, which is used to heat the leading edge of the wings and the engines. So those airplanes will handle a lot of ice. So it's going on to contaminated runways that are snow covered or ice covered. That presents more of a challenge than in-flight icing for the jets. The turboprops that can't produce that amount of hot air, they've still got some challenges in dealing with severe icing. But we try to avoid severe icing conditions anyway. So it's not something you want to fly in.
Well, talk about that a little bit, those runways, because again, as a younger man, I used to do snow removal for my dad's business. I mean, we used to run snow plows. They got snow plows out at the airport. I think some of these runways are actually heated, but I've always marveled at or wondered how the hell an airliner comes in and lands on just a frozen surface, let alone if it has snow or ice on it. I mean, that just doesn't even seem possible, but what, they do it all the time?
Yeah, we do it all the time. The information that the pilots need is what's the braking action? In other words, how effective are the brakes going to be? And they break that down into various categories. So you have a general idea about what's the surface like that you're going to land on. The point is you want to be on speed. You want the airplane down at the proper touchdown point. And then you want to let the airplane do as much of the work as it can. You want to dissipate all the lift, get as much weight on the wheels as you can, get the airplane into reverse thrust, and let it decelerate using the anti-skid system. And we do this routinely. It requires some skill and it requires some experience, but it can be done very safely, and it's done routinely.
Here's something that only I would think of. I got to ask, I don't know if you've been asked this, but you mentioned you started flying back in 1970. Well, before, and this is where this math comes in that I talked about with calculations prior to takeoff. You got weight is a huge deal. I don't know if you've noticed, I certainly have. Americans particularly, we've got a lot heavier since 1970. Does that change your calculation, your estimation of your weight, and how so?
Yeah, no, about, I guess, maybe 15 years ago, we upped the standard weights both for summer and winter because we're seeing a lot of people in North America that are pretty well fed, and so we've adjusted the performance calculations and weight and balance calculations to accommodate for that. And it works pretty well. We're seeing cases where the airplanes are fully loaded and they perform like they're supposed to. That's a check that the weight calculations are about right, because the airplane's performing accordingly.
Well, before we go here today, I mentioned off the top the company that you founded that you're involved with, Safety Operating Systems. Tell us a little bit about that.
We're an aviation safety consultancy that works with operators, both airline and business aviation, but also we do a lot of work with manufacturers and regulators. So it's a worldwide operation. We've had work on 6 continents. We haven't gotten to Antarctica yet, but we'd be glad to do some work there. And it's a wide variety. We work with emergency response planning. We work with crisis management, crisis communication, working with the news media. We help people improve their safety, but we also help them prepare should there be an incident or, heaven forbid, an accident, and how they can best respond to it.
Well, the captain's like a cold case investigator. As I mentioned, he's on television all the time analyzing these mishaps, accidents, tragedies. And one of the most recent that I saw, and of course that is still unsolved, is that Malaysia airliner that kind of flew off the earth. What's your take on that right now? Where do you think that's at?
Well, I think we know what happened, and I think we know how it happened. The question is, where's the airplane? And it's in a very remote part of the world. And there's a lot of debate, discussion, different opinions on where to go locate the wreckage. But we're talking 12 to 18,000 feet of water, and an area that's not overly well mapped. So it's a pretty remote part of the Indian Ocean. But as far as what happened, I think the evidence is pretty clear. It sadly was a deliberate act by probably the captain. So the airplane flew right down the boundary between 2 countries. And that allowed each country to believe the other one was in control of it. And so it didn't trip the military warnings that you would have expected. It goes out over the bay area, flies right up the bay in the middle of it, and then turns south into one of the most remote regions of the world. A mechanical failure won't do that. There's too many things that have to line up. So it's a commanded act. And sadly, it resulted in the loss of the airplane and everyone on board.
Well, here's what I'd say. The guy was a nut, obviously, to do something like that. And what I saw that was really revealing, eye-opening for me, they went into his laptop and they found out he had a simulator on there, and he kind of planned this out, right?
It's actually more, he had a flight simulator in his home that he had built. And there were some flights that had some similarities to that. The police investigation is still ongoing about that. So they haven't released full and complete data about what all they found as far as what routes were on there. But there were reports that some were similar to the flight path of Malaysia 370.
If I ever give up podcasting, I might get one of those home flight simulators. Have you ever seen one? Have you ever used one? What are those like?
I've trained in full motion simulators for decades, but I've not seen one at home that quite to this level of sophistication. This particular individual was a real aviation enthusiast. He helped mentor children and young men and women coming into the industry. He was a very senior captain. He was an instructor, so he was very, very involved in aviation in his country. So this is just kind of an outgrowth of his interest in aviation to have a flight simulator in his home.
Well, we got to let you go, and because you're a busy man. You got a lot of things to do just today, I know. And, of course, I mentioned the USA Today articles. I follow your TV stuff. I really like that. Do you have any projects in the works right now? Are there any things that we can look for with your television work coming up soon?
There's a couple of shows coming up on the 737 MAX as it returns to service, which should be before the end of the year. So I think you'll see in the last quarter of the year, first quarter next year, you'll see a couple of shows. I mean, we've already filmed my part of them, but they're in editing and they're being put together. So I would look for those, and they've done a pretty good job based on the questions that they asked me of research. So I think they'll be fairly balanced. The idea is to really tell the story and not try to affix blame on any one party, but to tell the story of one of the most complex aviation issues, accidents that has ever arisen. These two accidents are unbelievably complex when you start really peeling the layers back.
Well, and also you're an accomplished public speaker. I know you do a lot of that too, and I'm going to leave it with you here to give us a closing remark or two, just how you want to close up to finish off this particular episode of Podcast by George.
Well, first, I thank you for the opportunity to be here. People ask me a lot, how safe is aviation? And I'll close it with this. The most dangerous part of a trip in which you're going to fly on a commercial airliner is the drive to and from the airport.
That's great. All right, folks. That's Captain John Cox. He's the Chief Executive Officer. That is his daytime job with Safety Operating Systems. 49-year aviation expert, or 50 years, right around there. God, we're getting old, both of us. And, of course, he can be seen on NBC, MSNBC, CNBC, the Weather Channel with those Mayday things. Oh, my God, are those hair-raising. And, of course, look for his weekly column. I guess it's once a week. And Ask the Captain for USA Today. Captain, thanks again for coming on Podcast by George.
My pleasure, George.
And for folks, if you like Podcast by George, if you like this episode with Captain John Cox, please like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter, and subscribe on YouTube. Ring the notification bell so that you get all of these video podcasts. And, of course, subscribe on iTunes and places where the audio versions are heard while you're commuting, and you get to hear all this stuff. So that's going to wrap it up. That's going to do it. That's all there is, and there ain't no more. That's another podcast by George.